Ma'am, you're in the wrong building. Maintenance records are kept in the admin wing, 2 hangars down. The declaration hung in the air of Hangar 7 like a proclamation, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been challenged. The voice belonged to Derek Stone, senior crew chief, a man whose 23 years of service had calcified into an armor of assumptions. He stood with his weight shifted to one hip, a wrench dangling from his belt like a sidearm, his expression a mixture of amusement and irritation. Around him, his team of 7 technicians paused in their work. A ripple of knowing grins spread among them, a silent agreement that their chief had just performed his duty as gatekeeper, redirecting yet another lost pencil pusher who had wandered into their sacred domain of hydraulics and thrust vectoring. The woman who stood 20 feet from the nose of the Phantom Raven, the most classified aircraft in the United States inventory, did not respond. She did not turn her head. She did not adjust her stance. Her eyes remained fixed on the machine before her, a creation of swept angles and radar-absorbent surfaces that seemed to exist in defiance of physics itself. The aircraft was a study in controlled aggression, its lines flowing like liquid obsidian, its presence in the hangar creating shadows that appeared deeper than they should be. She wore a flight suit. That much was accurate, but it was devoid of patches, unit insignia, name tape, or rank. The fabric was a neutral charcoal gray, worn but meticulously maintained. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun that spoke of regulation rather than fashion, and her hands hung loosely at her sides, fingers slightly curled, relaxed, but not casual. Everything about her suggested someone who had simply appeared, summoned by some administrative error or bureaucratic mix-up. To Derek Stone's eye, trained by 2 decades of sorting personnel by their visible markers, she registered as a non-entity, a civilian contractor perhaps, or worse, some liaison from the Inspector General's office. In the observation booth overlooking the hangar floor, Colonel Marcus Reed watched through soundproof glass, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. He had arrived 15 minutes earlier for an unannounced inspection, intending to observe standard operations without the performance that his presence usually commanded. Now he stood motionless, his breath shallow, watching a scene unfold that he recognized with the clarity of a man who had witnessed career-ending mistakes before. He knew that posture. The slight forward cant of her shoulders, the way her feet were positioned, shoulder width apart, weight distributed with the precision of someone who had spent 10,000 hours in a cockpit fighting G-forces, the absolute economy of movement. She was not observing the Phantom Raven. She was communing with it, reading it, understanding it in a language that had no words. Stone, emboldened by his crew's supportive chuckles, took 3 steps forward, positioning himself directly in her line of sight. His boots echoed on the polished concrete floor, each step a small assertion of territorial dominance. Look, I don't know who told you that you could be in here, but this is a restricted area. Black program, eyes-only clearance, and I'm going to need to see your credentials or I'm going to need to escort you out now. His voice had risen in volume, playing to his audience, each word carefully chosen to establish his authority and her intrusion. The men behind him nodded, a few crossing their arms in mirror of their leader's stance. They had seen this before. Unauthorized personnel wandering into spaces they had no business being, lured by curiosity or simple disorientation in the massive complex. Stone was simply doing his job, protecting the program, maintaining security. They failed entirely to notice that she had not broken her focus, that her breathing remained slow and measured, the rhythm of someone in a meditative state, that her presence in the space was not that of an intruder, but of someone who belonged so completely that the very air seemed to make room for her. She blinked once, a slow, deliberate closure and opening of her eyes, and then, for the first time, she turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were a dark gray, the color of storm clouds over open ocean, and they held no emotion that Stone could identify. No fear, no defiance, no embarrassment. They simply observed him, catalogued him, and dismissed him as irrelevant in the span of perhaps 2 seconds. Then her gaze returned to the aircraft. The dismissal was so complete, so absolute, that Stone felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a small crack in his confidence. He had expected a reaction, a flustered apology, perhaps an indignant demand to speak to his supervisor. He had not expected to be erased from consideration as if he were furniture. If you found yourself captivated by this moment of silent authority, you'll want to subscribe to The Final Watch, where we bring you more stories of quiet competence that speaks louder than words, of professionals who prove their worth not through boast but through undeniable action. Hit that subscribe button now, because what unfolds next will redefine everything you thought you knew about true mastery. Stone opened his mouth to press his point, to escalate, to reassert the control that seemed to be slipping through his fingers like hydraulic fluid when the world detonated into chaos. The sound hit first, a piercing electronic wail that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, a klaxon designed to penetrate hearing protection and bone. Red emergency lights embedded in the hangar ceiling began their strobing rotation, bathing the entire space in a hellish pulsing crimson that turned shadows into living things. On the massive diagnostic display mounted on the eastern wall, green status indicators dissolved like sugar in acid, replaced by cascading lines of red text that scrolled too fast for human eyes to track. The technicians' practiced movements, honed by thousands of hours of routine maintenance, transformed instantly into frantic scrambling. Their calm was replaced by the sharp chemical taste of adrenaline and fear. "Primary flight computer is offline," someone shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The entire neural interface package just crashed. Another voice, younger, barely controlled. "We've got cascading failures across all redundant systems." Stone spun away from the woman, his manufactured authority evaporating like fuel in a fire. His face went from ruddy confidence to pale terror in the space between heartbeats. "Shut down the external power feed. Isolate the central processing core before we lose everything." His commands were sharp, desperate, the words of a man watching 10 years of work collapse in real time. The crew moved with practiced desperation, but their coordination had fractured. They were shouting over each other, calling out error codes and system failures, their technical expertise reduced to a cacophony of panic. The Phantom Raven, which moments before had been their pride, the pinnacle of their professional lives, had become a dying patient on an operating table, and they were surgeons who had forgotten their training. The woman moved. It was not a rush or a sprint. It was a smooth, unhurried translation through space, her footsteps making no sound against the floor, despite the chaos erupting around her. She moved like water finding its path, flowing around the scrambling technicians who were too focused on their failing diagnostics to notice her passage. She reached the boarding ladder, a telescoping aluminum structure positioned against the Raven's fuselage, and began to climb. Her hands found each rung without looking down, her body moving with a muscle memory so ingrained it was indistinguishable from instinct. Stone, in the midst of barking orders at a technician trying to manually reboot a subsystem, caught her movement in his peripheral vision. For a moment, his crisis management and his territorial instinct warred with each other. "Hey, you can't," he started to say, his hand reaching out as if to physically stop her from 30 feet away. But his words died in his throat as she reached the cockpit rim and swung herself inside with a fluid grace that spoke of 10,000 repetitions. The canopy was already open, locked in its raised position for the diagnostic session. She dropped into the pilot's seat, and the chaos of the hangar floor seemed to recede, becoming a distant thunder. The cockpit interior was dark, the multifunction displays dead black screens, the heads-up display projector a lifeless piece of glass. Only the angry red glow of a few hardwired emergency indicators provided any light, casting her face in sharp relief, all angles and shadows. The alarm inside the cockpit was physically painful, a shrieking electronic scream designed to force immediate action. But she did not flinch. She did not rush to slap buttons or throw switches. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her thighs, and she listened. Not with her ears, but with something deeper, a sense that extended beyond the normal 5, reading the vibrations through the airframe, feeling the electromagnetic signature of dying systems, understanding the pattern of failure in the way a doctor reads a failing heartbeat. Then her hands moved. They rose from her lap with the slow, purposeful grace of a conductor beginning a symphony. Her left hand drifted to a recessed panel below the central console, a location that most of the maintenance crew believed was simply a cosmetic cover for wiring harness access. Her index finger found a small, flush-mounted switch, nearly invisible in the red emergency lighting, and depressed it with exactly 4 pounds of pressure. A subsonic hum, felt more than heard, traveled through the aircraft's frame, a deep resonance that suggested the awakening of something fundamental. Her right hand went to the control stick, not gripping it for flight, but resting her palm against its textured surface, her fingers making contact with specific points on its circumference. She began a sequence of movements so subtle they were almost imperceptible, micro-adjustments that would have been invisible to anyone watching from more than 5 feet away. A slight forward pressure, a fractional rotation counterclockwise, a gentle aft deflection. each input measured in millimeters and ounces. She was not flying the aircraft. She was speaking to it in a language composed of pressure and timing, a dialect known to perhaps 3 people on Earth, a backdoor conversation with the machine's deepest architecture. Below, the maintenance crew had gone silent. Their frantic activity had stuttered to a halt as they realized someone was in the cockpit, someone who was not frozen by panic, but moving with an eerie, absolute calm. Derek Stone stood at the base of the boarding ladder, staring upward, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. He watched her silhouetted form through the canopy, her movements precise and unhurried, and something in his gut, some ancient instinct refined by evolution to recognize predators, told him that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. On the main diagnostic screen, the cascading red error messages faltered. They stopped their relentless scroll. A single line of amber text appeared, then another, this time in a different font, a deeper level of system code that was not supposed to be accessible during standard operations. She was bypassing the corrupted primary systems entirely, speaking directly to the Raven's core operating kernel, using an access protocol that existed in no technical manual, a sequence she had written herself during the aircraft's development, a failsafe that even the program's lead engineers had forgotten existed. Her fingers moved across the dark surface of the central multifunction display, touching points that corresponded to no visible button or icon. She was navigating by memory, by an internal map of the aircraft's digital soul that was more accurate than any blueprint. And then, with a final deliberate press of 3 specific points in a precise sequence, a triangle of pressure applied in a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, it happened. The alarm died, not gradually, not winding down, but instantly, as if a switch had been thrown. The piercing shriek that had filled the hangar for 90 seconds simply ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. The red emergency lights in the cockpit blinked out, replaced by the steady, warm glow of systems coming online. Green indicators appearing one by one across the instrument panel, like stars emerging at dusk. The main diagnostic screen, which had been a scrolling nightmare of failure, went black for 3 seconds, then resolved into a single line of crisp white text against a blue background. All systems nominal, primary and backup diagnostics green, awaiting pilot input. A low, powerful hum filled the hangar, the sound of the Phantom Raven's internal power systems initializing, not with a stuttering, uncertain comeback, but with the smooth, confident surge of perfect health. The entire resurrection had taken 42 seconds. 42 seconds of silent, focused competence that had accomplished what 6 trained technicians and their senior crew chief could not. The silence in the hangar was total and absolute. It was the silence of a congregation that had just witnessed a miracle. The silence of men whose entire understanding of their world had just been turned inside out. Derek Stone's mouth was open, his hand still half raised in his aborted gesture of prohibition. His mind was scrambling, trying to construct a narrative that made sense, trying to find an explanation that did not require him to accept the impossible.
"That's not," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast space. "That's not any protocol. That's not possible." But the green lights mocking him from every display screen said otherwise. The healthy hum of the aircraft, a sound he had heard 1,000 times, but never quite like this, never this clean, this perfect, said otherwise. The silence was shattered by the metallic ring of boots on steel, a sharp, measured cadence descending from the observation deck. Every head in the hangar turned in unison to see Colonel Marcus Reed striding down the gantry stairs, his face set in an expression of iron control, but his eyes were blazing with an intensity that made even the most senior technicians take an unconscious step back. He did not speak to the assembled crew. He walked with a purpose that carved a path through the thick, charged air, moving directly to a secure terminal mounted near the Raven's nose gear. His movements were sharp, angry, not at the woman in the cockpit, but at the situation, at what he knew was coming, at the humiliation he was about to inflict and witness. The technicians watched, frozen, as the colonel accessed the terminal with his personal authorization codes, his fingers striking the keys with percussive force. On the main gantry screen, the system nominal message dissolved, replaced by a secure personnel file, the kind with multiple clearance warnings and classified designations that most of them had never seen outside of security briefings. The name appeared first, clinical and simple. Reeves, Jordan, Technical Sergeant. The rank designation hit like a physical blow. Technical Sergeant. A senior, non-commissioned officer rank, the kind that carried weight, that spoke of years of specialized expertise. Stone felt his stomach drop, a sensation like falling from a great height. The file continued to populate, each line of text a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. Unit assignment, Advanced Aerospace Development Division,
Directorate of Special Projects, Skunk Works Detachment 7. A gasp, audible and collective, went through the assembled crew. Skunk Works was not just a program, it was a legend, a place where the rules of physics were negotiated rather than obeyed, where the aircraft that would define the next generation of warfare were born in secrecy and silence. Call sign Wraith. One of the older technicians, a master sergeant with gray temples and 30 years of service, made a small choked sound. Wraith was a ghost story, a call sign, whispered in the dark corners of classified programs, attached to feats of aviation that sounded like fiction, impossible maneuvers, prototype flights that should have ended in fireballs but ended instead in flawless landings and rewritten flight envelopes. Total flight hours, Phantom Raven program, 6,217. The number hung in the air like an accusation. 6,000 hours. The entire test pilot program for the Raven, every pilot who had ever touched the controls, had logged perhaps 3,000 hours combined. She had not just flown the Raven, she had been its primary operator for the entirety of its development cycle. She knew it not as a machine, but as an extension of her own nervous system. Commendations, the list scrolled, Air Force Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross with 4 oak leaf clusters, Defense Superior Service Medal, Air Medal with 12 oak leaf clusters. The screen filled with the documented evidence of a career spent at the absolute edge of human capability, a litany of valor and skill that most officers would never approach in 30 years of service. And then came the final line, the one that transformed the situation from embarrassing to catastrophic. Current assignment, Lead Development Officer and Chief Test Pilot, Phantom Raven Advanced Flight Systems. Primary Architect, Emergency Recovery Protocols and Neural Interface Bypass Systems. Stone felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He had not just dismissed a senior NCO. He had not just insulted a decorated pilot. He had stood in the presence of the woman who had built the system he was failing to understand, who had written the code that ran through the Raven's electronic veins, and he had treated her like an inconvenience, like a lost secretary who had wandered into the wrong building. The recovery sequence she had just performed was not a trick or a fortunate guess. It was her signature woven into the fundamental architecture of the aircraft, a failsafe that she had designed and could execute with her eyes closed, because she had done so 100 times during development, refining it until it was perfect. Colonel Reed turned from the terminal, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the hangar until they found the cockpit of the Raven. Technical Sergeant Reeves was emerging, swinging her legs over the cockpit sill with the same fluid economy of movement that had carried her up the ladder. She descended, each boot finding its rung with the certainty of muscle memory, her expression as neutral and calm as it had been when she first walked into the hangar an eternity and 5 minutes ago. The colonel waited until her boots touched the concrete floor. Then, in a movement so precise it could have been measured with instruments, he brought his heels together, straightened his spine, and raised his hand in a salute so sharp and formal it belonged on a parade ground, not in a maintenance hangar. Technical Sergeant Jordan Reeves, his voice rang out clear and hard, carrying to every corner of the vast space on behalf of this command and this program. I apologize for the unprofessional and disrespectful reception you received. Thank you for reminding us what true expertise looks like. The gesture was seismic. A full colonel, a man with 28 years of service and command over thousands of personnel, saluting an enlisted, non-commissioned officer. It violated no regulation technically, but it reversed the social order, the unspoken hierarchy that governed military life. It was a public acknowledgement of mastery, a transfer of respect so complete and unambiguous that it redefined every relationship in the room. Reeves stopped, her eyes meeting the colonel's. For a moment, something flickered across her face, not surprise, but a weary recognition, the look of someone who had seen this pattern before, who understood that respect delayed is respect earned through pain. She returned the salute with equal precision, a silent acceptance of his apology, an acknowledgement of the order he had just restored through sheer force of will. Then she lowered her hand and simply stood there, waiting. The assembled technicians, as if released from a spell, began to move. One by one, they straightened, their spines lengthening, their hands going to their sides, their faces forward. They came to attention, a ragged formation of men who had just been taught a lesson they would carry for the rest of their careers. Derek Stone was the last to move. His body felt like it was made of stone, heavy, and cold. He forced his arms to his sides, forced his back straight, forced his chin up, his gaze fixed on the far wall of the hangar, because he would not meet her eyes. He had built his identity on being the expert, the guardian, the man who knew more about these machines than anyone. In less than a minute, this quiet woman had demonstrated a chasm of competence so vast he could not see the other side, and she had done it without saying a single word. Her silence had been louder than any speech, her actions more damning than any rebuke. She had not needed to put him in his place. She had simply occupied hers, and his had been revealed as a small, insignificant shadow by comparison. The story of what would come to be known as the Wraith Protocol spread through the base like fire through dry grass. It moved through the ready rooms and maintenance bays, through the officers' mess and the enlisted barracks, transmitted not through official channels, but through the urgent, hushed conversations of people who had witnessed something they needed to share. With each retelling, the story gained weight and detail. They said she had not touched the controls, that she had simply looked at the aircraft and it had healed itself out of sheer recognition. They whispered that the error codes had been a message, a cry from the machine to its creator. The truth, as always, was both more mundane and more profound. It was a story of expertise so deep it appeared magical, of a professional who had forgotten more about that aircraft than most would ever learn.
For Derek Stone, the days that followed were a crucible. He moved through his duties with mechanical precision. The boisterous confidence that had defined him burned away, leaving only the raw framework of a man rebuilding himself from the foundation up. His crew watched him, waiting to see what would emerge from the ashes of his humiliation. On the fourth day, he found her. She was in the simulator building, overseeing a training session for a group of new pilots fresh from advanced flight school. Stone stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her work. She was not lecturing them or demonstrating her superiority. She was asking them questions, guiding them to discover the answers themselves, her voice low and patient, pointing to specific data streams and asking what they saw, what it meant, why it mattered. Finally, he stepped inside, removing his cap, holding it in both hands. "Technical Sergeant Reeves," he said quietly. She turned, her expression neutral. The young pilots looked from Stone to her, sensing the gravity of what was about to happen. "Ma'am, I need to apologize," Stone began, and his voice, stripped of all its former bluster, was raw and honest. "What I did was inexcusable. I made assumptions based on nothing but my own arrogance, and I disrespected you and this program. There is no excuse for my conduct. It was the greatest professional failure of my career." He did not offer explanations or justifications. He owned his failure completely, laying it bare without decoration or defense. Reeves studied his face for a long moment, her gray eyes seeing past the words to the man beneath. Then she gave a single, small nod. "Apology accepted. Crew Chief Stone," she said, her voice even and without triumph. Now she gestured to the simulator display. "We have a problem with the secondary hydraulic response curve that I need your expertise on. The override protocol is creating a feedback loop. Help me understand what you're seeing in the data." She was teaching him that true professionalism was not about never failing, but about what you did after failure, how you learned, how you grew. In that moment, Stone understood that he had been wrong about everything. And with those words, she had not only accepted his apology, but invited him into her world, acknowledged his expertise, and given him a path forward. He had mistaken volume for value, position for competence, assumptions for knowledge. The lesson would reshape the rest of his career, becoming his own story to tell, a warning to every new technician who walked into his hangar. He became a different kind of leader after that day, one who listened before he spoke, who judged people by the quality of their work rather than the visibility of their credentials. The legend of Jordan Reeves became his teaching tool, a constant reminder that the most dangerous person in any room is often the quietest one. The story solidified into something permanent. The emergency recovery sequence that Technical Sergeant Reeves had executed became formalized in the Phantom Raven's technical orders, officially designated the Wraith Protocol, a last resort measure for total system failure. At the bottom of the procedure, in small print, was a note that every technician and pilot would eventually read. This protocol was developed under operational conditions by TSG Reeves. That single line became a source of pride for everyone associated with the program. A month after the incident, a small plaque appeared on the wall of the main simulator bay. No one took credit for installing it. It simply appeared one morning, bolted securely to the bulkhead, where every pilot would see it before strapping in. It read, in case of total system failure, breathe, think, do what Wraith would do. It became a ritual. Before difficult training runs, pilots would reach out and touch the cool metal, a small gesture to connect with the standard she had set, a reminder that competence speaks louder than any call sign or rank insignia. Reeves herself deflected all attempts at recognition. When a military publication tried to interview her about the incident, she declined. When Colonel Reed attempted to present her with a formal commendation at a base assembly, she was suddenly needed at a critical flight test 200 miles away. Her reward was not fame or recognition. It was the flawless performance of the aircraft she had helped create,
and the growing competence of the people who flew and maintained it. Her legacy was not meant to be etched in plaques or written in commendations. It was meant to be written in the perfect execution of a combat mission, in the confidence of a young pilot mastering an impossible maneuver, in the focused silence of a maintenance bay where people no longer made assumptions but looked for evidence of skill. Years moved forward. The Phantom Raven transitioned from classified prototype to operational weapon system deployed to forward bases around the world. The stories of its development became part of military lore, passed down through generations of pilots and crew chiefs, and at the center of that lore was the quiet legend of a pilot with the call sign Wraith. The Wraith Protocol was now taught at every level of training, from basic maintenance school to advanced tactical courses. The story of its origin was always included, a mandatory lesson in humility, a cautionary tale about the danger of assumptions. Derek Stone rose through the ranks, eventually becoming the senior enlisted advisor for the entire Phantom Raven program. He was known as a fair but demanding leader, a man with an uncanny ability to identify real talent and an absolute intolerance for arrogance. He began every briefing to new personnel with the same story. "Let me tell you about the day I met a true professional," he would say, his voice quiet and reflective. "Let me tell you about the day I learned that the loudest voice in the room is usually the one that has the least to say." His story became a teaching tool, passed through the program like a sacred text, a reminder that respect is not given based on volume or visibility, but earned through undeniable competence.
Technical Sergeant Jordan Reeves remained. She resisted every attempt at promotion, preferring to stay close to the aircraft to remain a practitioner rather than an administrator. She could still be found on the flight line, her faded gray flight suit now a familiar sight, quietly observing pre-flight checks, her presence alone a guarantee that standards would be maintained. She had become an institution, a living reminder of the standard that had been set. One evening, a young lieutenant, a woman barely 25 years old and fresh from flight school, was preparing for her first solo flight in the Raven. She was terrified, her confidence shaken by the weight of the machine and the expectations that came with it. As she completed her final checks, she saw Reeves standing on the tarmac watching. Their eyes met across 50 feet of concrete. Reeves gave a single, small nod, barely perceptible, a silent transfer of confidence, a blessing from the program's quiet guardian. The young lieutenant took a breath, her hands steadying on the controls. She reached out and touched the worn plaque on her console, whispered, "Do what Wraith would do," and advanced the throttles. Her takeoff was perfect. Legacy is not built in monuments or awards. It is built in the standards you set that others choose to follow. It is measured not in the stories told about you, but in the quiet competence you inspire in those who come after. Jordan Reeves' legacy was not in her medals or her flight hours or the aircraft she had helped design. It was in the steady hands of that young pilot, in the focused eyes of a crew chief teaching humility to his team, in a culture that had been permanently changed by the undeniable truth that what you are speaks so loudly the world has no need to hear what you say. True worth is not announced. It is demonstrated, forged in the silent crucible of crisis, proven in the execution of impossible tasks, and measured by the respected commands when all the talking is done. The Phantom Raven, for all its technological marvel, was just a machine. Its spirit came from the quiet professional who knew its secrets, who had breathed life into its systems, and who, through her actions alone, had taught an entire generation that the most powerful voice in any room is often the one that remains silent.